I see them to democratic participation. So I'm going to get off my soapbox on this class, and I wanted to start to get back to issues related to community development. However, I don't know if any of you all either work in the world of development, of international aid projects, or if you follow the news, but it's kind of hard to get away from all politics these days. One of the things that I'm sure many of you all have seen is that in the past month or so, the president of the United States has cut about 90% of foreign aid, especially through U.S. aid, but also through some of the other departments that have been involved in aid. So, for example, the United States is no longer a part of the World Health Organization. State Department grants to foreign countries have been cut by more than 75%. And then, of course, U.S. aid has also been cut by 90%. And it's not just an issue in the United States. Many of the European countries have also drastically reduced the amount of foreign aid that they're giving. Germany, the UK, even countries that have been kind of the leaders in at least dedicating a little bit more than 1% of their gross of their national budget, such as Sweden, just announced 2 days ago that they're also going to be cutting back. So I think now is an important time to kind of, because of all of these fairly massive budget cuts to the international aid industry, I think it's an important time to start to rethink how development work is done. What is the hierarchy in how international development aid is dispersed? And how these recent budget cuts that are affecting, I'm sure I know a lot of our students are from Africa, and there are billions of dollars of cuts, both from the United States and other European countries, from the developed world in general. And I wanted to discuss both in class today and then also class on the 27th. So in about a week and a half, it's a two-part series that I want to kind of think about, what are the repercussions of this loss in aid, and how can we respond to this in a positive light? How can we see this kind of restructuring on the global level of how international aid is going to be distributed, not only in dollar amounts, right? There's obviously a reduction, but also in how it's going to be dispersed. In the next class, I want to take a look at some of the things that are being said, not only by heads of state, but also by leaders of these important aid organizations that are essentially what is being said openly nowadays is that any aid project has to be in line with the strategic national interests, the foreign policy interests of the donor countries. And I think that's going to be kind of a real game changer in how international aid projects, how development projects are organized, how they're written up, and how they are implemented in communities. So I'm going to talk more about that in about 10 days. But just 3 days ago, I was on a consulting call. I participate once a month in a consulting call with a number of organizations that work in the area of regenerative agriculture, regreening the landscape around the world. And there was a lot of worry by organizations that work in Southeast Asia, that work in African countries, that work in Latin American countries. The vast majority of the organizations that I was consulting with have had to lay off many of their employees, many of the people who work in the field of community development. And there was, at the beginning of the meeting, there was lots of kind of discussion about how can we reverse this trend. And by the end of the meeting, I think a lot of people who are in this kind of realize that this is the direction of the world in which we live. This is the current policy, the current politics. And so the second part of the consulting Zoom meeting that we were on with about 70 organizations around the world who work again in the space of regenerative agriculture, we started to discuss what opportunities might be made available due to this restructuring of aid. So as always, the Greek word crisis means turning point. If you go back to the etymology of the world, so, of the word, so if we see the current financing crisis, the financial crisis in the world of aid, which is just beginning, and that many people think will become much more critical in the coming months and years. If we see this as a crisis, as in a turning point, how can we start to rethink what development means, right? I, of course, as many of you know, always turn to one of my, I would say, intellectual heroes in my own kind of educational journey, Ivan Illich. He wrote several books back in the 1970s. We've discussed several of them in past classes. And I've made mention in many classes of one of his most famous books, which is called Tools for Conviviality. But we never really took a moment, a class, to really dive into his thoughts. So I wanted to, this kind of two-part class today, I wanted to set kind of a conceptual framework for how we can rethink development using the thought of Ivan Illich. So in this short book that he wrote, Tools for Conviviality, he talks a lot about the issues of thresholds, of modernized poverty, and how communities need to always maintain in mind the importance of striving for autonomy in their own decisions, in determining their own fate, determining their futures, determining what goodness entails, right? So I wanted to set this kind of conceptual framework using the work of Ivan Illich today, so that tomorrow in the next class, next week, we can take a look really at some of the numbers behind this crisis in the world of international aid. Like I said, is about a month old. It's been about a month since Elon Musk and Donald Trump announced these massive cuts to U.S. aid and other platforms, and about a month since many of the other donor countries from the European Union, from other wealthy countries, have kind of followed lead. And so this crisis, this turning point, I think is going to offer us an opportunity to rethink development. So as a conceptual framework, I want to start by looking at Illich's discussion of what he terms counterproductivity. That term might be a little confusing, but we'll try and unpack that. And then Illich's definition of modernized poverty. And one of the things that I've always kind of struggled with in the world of community development is this idea that wealthy, developed countries kind of assume the monopoly on deciding and defining what poverty entails, right? There's obviously, issues around what poverty is and what it isn't. Um, but this idea that poverty is anything that does not conform to these Western ideals of affluence, right? I think is very limiting. And one of the things that was fascinating about Illich's work is that he was very much in favor of traditional lifestyles. We've talked about his use of the word vernacular or subsistence as something that exists outside the commodity economy, the industrial economy. And most development organizations hear the word subsistence, right? And say that that is something that we need to overcome. It is an evil that needs to be defeated, right? We talk about the war on subsistence poverty, right? For Illich, however, he said that there is a different idea of poverty, wherein a return to the vernacular, to the subsistence, is something that's positive. So I want to try and unpack again what he thinks of modernized poverty and how he uses this word conviviality as a way of redefining how we can understand good development practices, right? Good development practices are not just about trying to force people to mimic the development patterns of the global West, of the United States, of Europe, of Western Europe, of Japan. But conviviality is about how people can discover ways to create their own pathways towards goodness. So that's kind of, and then the issue of thresholds was always very, very important in Illich's work. He was not anti-technology. He was not anti-West. He was not anti-modernity. But what he did say is that we need to have a criticality to our thought that allows us to determine what level right, of modernity, what level of technology, what level of things from the outside we will accept and implement into our lives. And that is about this issue of thresholds, right? So I'm going to try and unpack all of these kind of Illich was a very, very intellectual academic writer, and sometimes it's hard to understand what he was getting at, but I'm going to do my best to try and use this thought around counterproductivity, modernized poverty, conviviality, and the issue of thresholds to see how we can use this as a framework for rethinking development in light of the crisis we're living in today in the world of development practice. So, development, as a definition, means a specified state of growth or advancement, right? And that's kind of what Illich says is that one of the issues in modernity is we have these words, these ideas that everybody seems to know what they mean, though nobody really digs into to the nuances that are hidden within their meaning, right? So if we say that development is universally good, and most people, when we talk about, the work we do in foreign aid, in international cooperation, we say, oh, we're working for development. We're working to develop communities, right? But what really does that entail? I think that for most people, we would say that we live in the age of expectation, right? Wherein one of the foundational assumptions of our modern times is that continued growth, right? A specified state of growth, of advancement, of innovation, of technological innovation. Of exploration, etc., will inevitably lead us into a future of currently unknown possibilities. There is no end point to progress. There is no end point to development. Most people assume that whereas, wealthy nations have, it's not that there is a standard to which we all have to achieve. It's that there is this upward trend of growth, of affluence, of wealth, of technological advancement that everybody should get on. It's like we're on an escalator that continues going up. And the idea of development projects is to get everybody onto that escalator, even though we're on different levels, right? Even though, people who live in industrialized and developed nations are higher up on the escalator, as long as we're all on this pathway moving upwards, then things are going to be fine, right? One of the proponents of this kind of mentality is Kevin Kelly. He's a philosopher who he's been termed the philosopher of Silicon Valley. He's very into this idea that continued growth in technology is the next step in human evolution. This idea that human evolution is this continued onward march towards progress, right? And by unequivocally accepting technological advancements and ensuring that technology and current growth patterns are available to everybody, everybody's going to be on that upward escalator. Kevin Kelly wrote a book back in 2010 called What Technology Wants, and he lays it out fairly clearly. He says that our mission as humans, right, our purpose as human beings is not only to discover our fullest selves in the technium, which is the world of technology, and to find full contentment, but to expand the possibilities for others. Greater technology will selfishly unleash our talents, but it will also unselfishly unleash others to our children and children to come. He also said that despite all of the drawbacks that come with technology, he was a realist. He understood that, for example, the introduction of the smartphone into the world has caused addiction, has caused all sorts of problems with young people and their screen time. He's a realist. He understands that, but he says that that he has a faith in the arc of technological progress, which is kind of taking a line from Martin Luther King, who said that the arc of history always bends towards justice. And Kevin Kelly says the arc of technological progress always tends towards betterment, even though there's things that are negative, right? So Kevin Kelly is kind of this spokesperson for this belief that progress and growth and development always tends toward betterment, right? And so the work of people who work in third world countries, who work in rural communities, is simply about trying to get people onto that escalator of upward movement, right? And it's very uncritical, right, of what development is. We don't talk about what is that specific state of growth. We don't look at what what this advancement entails. We don't think of the potential drawbacks that come with that, right? But I would say that one of my critique of development is that it is that we uncritically kind of embrace this idea of upward mobility, of upward movement, of a kind of naive belief that economic growth and technological development are going to take us all to kind of the golden gates of a future kind of utopia. One of the great things about Ivan Illich, however, is that 50, 60 years ago, when this explosion of economic growth, this explosion of technological advancement was really starting to gain steam, he was one of the first to put his foot on the brake and say that no, we have to have the ability to be critical, right? To be thoughtful about what this growth, what he termed kind of industrial modernity is bringing to us, right? So he says this is from his book, from the introduction to his book, Tools for Conviviality. He says it is possible for humanity to identify a natural scale, right? When an enterprise, anything, a business, a government, an economic system, a technological group of tools, whatever an enterprise it is, whenever an enterprise grows beyond a certain point on this scale, it first frustrates the end for which it was originally designed, and then rapidly becomes a threat to society itself. What he was saying is that beyond a certain threshold, remember, I want us to keep this idea in mind that thresholds is a very important concept in Illich's thinking. When we move beyond a certain threshold, the upward escalator, the upward movement stalls. And it's not only that it levels out, but it starts to go down, right? The drawbacks, the issues become cause more damage than the good that they offer, right? From Illich's perspective, unhampered economic growth, continuous innovation in technological development, the development of industrial goods and services eventually led to a paradoxical, what he called counterproductivity, wherein the good or the service worked against the purpose it was originally intended to serve, right? So he was very critical of the idea of the movement of human beings, the transportation industry, right? So he said, obviously, there is a something good about opening up, for example, buses and trucks to move goods and services. But when we got to this point where everybody wanted their own private vehicle, right? Then what we have is that, a person who lived outside of Mexico City, just to name one example, could have taken the bus from, their suburb or the outskirt of the city into the center of the city in about half an hour if there was a good, positive public transportation system that was available and open to everyone, right? Now that we have this idea that everybody needs to have their own private car, it takes 3, 4, 5, 6 hours for people, right? There is a study in San Salvador, the city, the big city in the country where I live in, where the average person, the average worker in the city spends between 4 and 6 hours every day commuting to work, right? So between a sixth and a fourth of their working life is spent in traffic, right? Illich would say this is an obvious example of the counterproductivity of the enterprise of mobility, right? The technology of transportation, right? Transportation can be positive up to a certain limit, up to a certain threshold. But if we pass that threshold, it becomes counterproductive, right? Another example from my line of work as a farmer is the idea of kind of synthetic nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium fertilizer, right? 50, 60, 70 years ago, when the Green Revolution came around, there was this idea that synthesizing the nutrient needs of plants could boost cause a major boost to the productivity, to yields of agriculture. And at first, there was, and many people make the argument that up to a certain level, complementing traditional forms of agriculture, of creating compost, of spreading manure on fields, of rotating crops, of planting green cover crops, there is a space where synthetic fertilizer, up to a certain level, up to a certain point, can be beneficial. But what happened is all of those traditional practices, rotating crops, reducing tillage, spreading compost and manure, all of these traditional peasant farming practices were completely challenged and replaced by wide-scale use of NPK fertilizer. And what we see today is the complete loss of topsoil, right? So we got to a level where instead of understanding, respecting this threshold, we just shot past it. And so now there's a crisis in something as essential as the topsoil, which ensures that humanity has a future of agricultural yields, right? Lastly, Illich was also understood that this counterproductivity didn't just apply to things, to industrial goods, but also to the service industry, right? To the industry of professionals. And we had a class about a year ago looking at what Illich talked about public schooling. He said that, public schooling, making schooling available to everyone up to a certain point could be beneficial, right? But when we completely replace the natural tendency for young people to want to learn, right, with this idea that learning only happens in the public school, then we cross this threshold, he said, right? And it becomes counterproductive. And many young people lose this natural tendency, this natural wonder with the world, the ability to go out and to discover things as they get enclosed into this school atmosphere where they have it drilled into their brain that only the school teacher has knowledge, right? And that we can only garner knowledge from the professional. Um, so yeah, talking about these watersheds or these thresholds, he says that first, new knowledge is applied to a solution of a clearly stated problem, and the scientific measuring sticks are applied to account for the new efficiency, right? So this idea that certain types of transportation technologies are hugely beneficial. Illich was a huge proponent of the bicycle, especially in densely populated urban areas. He said the bicycle is a great tool. It's a convivial tool because it can be made available to anyone. It drastically increases the speed at which people can move. It's not contaminating. It's a tool that's simple to fix, that's within the budget of most people, right? And so he said in urban areas, using the transportation tool of a bicycle makes great sense. But then at a second point, the progress demonstrated in a previous achievement is used as a rationale for the exploitation of society as a whole in service of a value which is determined and constantly revised by an element of society, by one of its self-certifying elites. And Illich would say, obviously, there are people who can't use bicycles, people who have handicaps, people, elderly people, pregnant women. And so he said we can use the internal combustion engine for buses, for public transportation, for creating a metro or a train station. But then the embedded interests in the economy said, no, we're just going to continue to exploit this in this private vehicle. So what you see, this is a picture in San Salvador that you'll see any day, where people in cars end up spending twice as much time on their commute as people in bicycles. And it's because, he says, we have lost the ability to understand the watershed, understand the threshold, understand the moment when a certain tool becomes counterproductive, right? The second watershed, the second threshold, in other words, is the moment at which any industrial staple, be it a hospital or a highway system, begins to get in its own way and defeat its declared purpose, right? If the declared purpose of a public highway system is to improve the mobility of the human person, of the communities, well, then we have to see at what moment knocking over a forest to build a massive 12-lane highway so that more people can get stuck into traffic, that doesn't make sense anymore. It becomes counterproductive, right? And one of the things this is how do we determine when counterproductivity starts to kick in? And Illich says the key criterion is autonomy, autonomous action, right? Does a certain tool or a certain service or a certain industrial output enable me or my community to accomplish our own ends, or does it reshape our ends to fit the available means, right? Do people who live in urban areas, can they safely take a bicycle anymore, or has the the implementation of massive transportation infrastructure, right? The idea of the private vehicle that everybody has to have. Does that start to make it impossible for people to choose autonomously how they mobilize themselves, right? When the second watershed is reached, means becomes ends. Keeping the game going becomes the game, right? So he outlines five kind of ideas, right, of how we can understand when the counterproductivity of industrial goods and services starts to kick in, right? Number one, when overgrowth of a industrial tool, an industrial service, a professional service, right, threatens the right to fundamental physical structure of the environment which man has involved, right? Let's continue with the transportation kind of metaphor, right? When the paths that led through the woods are replaced by massive highway systems, for example, right? When the farm, which used to be something that we could work with our own human body, becomes transformed into this monoculture that requires massive machines and massive, hundreds of thousands of dollars of tractors and inputs just to maintain a profit, right? That's when the physical structure of the world in which we have evolved is changed, right? Due to the demands of economic growth, due to the demands of industrial productivity, right? That's the first sign that we've started to reach this threshold of counterproductivity. Number two, when industrialization threatens the right to convivial work, right? When, because of the market mechanisms that demand a certain type of agricultural output, the small farmer is pushed off of his land. The price of land becomes too expensive. The Chinese government or whoever it might be starts this land grabbing where they start to artificially inflate the prices of land so that they can take that land away from people, right? When the right to convivial work in convivial work, Illich would say, also exists in the vernacular realm, right? Things that are not done necessarily for a commodity, right? Or not necessarily done for a vernacular, but for subsistence, for use values, right? When the small farmer is obliged by the system in which we live to cut down all of his diverse kind of permacultural practices and only produce one product for the market because that's what the market demands. That's another sign that we've arrived to this threshold, right? Number three, the over programming of man for the new environment deadens his creative imagination, right? The small farmer in my community, many of them have lost the skills and the knowledge about how to create a regenerative, thriving, diverse landscape of crops and animals and vegetables and fruits and grains, right? Something that always defined traditional peasant agriculture. We've lost this creative imagination, right? Many people have lost the ability to understand even, how to ride a bicycle, how to fix it if it gets because we've been conditioned to understand that that sitting in traffic for hours every day is just kind of our lot in life. This is what's expected of the worker class in these massive urban areas around the world. Number four, new levels of productivity threaten the right to participatory politics, right? We talked about this in the last couple classes that as the political realm grows beyond a certain threshold, what we think is our political kind of responsibility in life is simply to vote every couple of years, right? Instead of being involved, on a very participatory, a very intimate level in the decisions that affect us, right? We have replaced democratic participation with representative democracy, where all that's expected of us, at the very most, is to vote every couple of years. And lastly, enforced obsolescence threatens the right to tradition, right? The recourse to precedent, language, myth, morals. We lose any kind of normative connection to the past, right? Everything, because we're on this upward escalator, right, of continued growth, of continued technological advancement. The past, what's below us, what we left behind, is no longer normative. It no longer has any, real say in how we live our lives. Another guiding assumption of modernity, that Illich said, is that the forward and always onward march of progress liberates humanity from the shackles of poverty, right? Most people who work in the development world kind of assume that people on the escalator that are going up, what they're leaving behind is inevitably going to be worse than what they achieve above, right? However, very rarely do we take time to really analyze that, to see if that is true, right? It's just kind of an assumption, right? This assumption that whatever is higher on the escalator, whatever we're moving towards, is unequivocally going to be better than what we left behind. And questioning that assumption isn't romanticizing the past, right? We can look with a realistic lens at some of the traditions, some of the things that perhaps were constricting, some of the things that were not the best, but kind of tossing out the baby with the bathwater, as the saying goes, is naive. I think it's intellectually kind of lazy to do that, right? This linear view of progress, that most development organizations adhere to, and that Illich says is one of the defining aspects of modernity, presupposes that novelty, so anything that's new, is equivalent to betterment, right? The new iPhone that comes out is going to be better than the last one, right? Not because it offers necessarily any features, anything that's actually makes our lives better, but because it's new, simply because it's new, right? Uh, this linear view of progress presupposes that novelty is betterment without attempting to sort through the nuances that come with development, right? Without taking the time to think about that. We are a culture today who has erased the expenses and debits columns in our accounting practices, right? So this is, anybody who's studied accounting, this is a pretty basic 3-column ledger, right? What are our debits? What are our credits? And what is our balance, right? So if I have a small business on our farm, right, where I'm not very good at this. I don't do this, but I should write down, how much time I spent, how much money I spent on purchasing seed, what were the inputs in hours that I worked. Here are my debits, and here are the credits. How much vegetables did I sell this week? And here's my balance, right? We could do this on a larger scale for humanity, right? But what happens is we always think about the credits. We always think about what technology brings to us, what economic growth brings to us, what modernity enables us to do, right? But we don't think about the debits, right? The one of the tenets of global capitalism is that the externalities of global capitalism are never factored into the equation, right? There are studies that show that if we really try to take seriously, the prices of the ecological services that nature provides us, right? Air to breathe, water, soil to grow our crops. If we really tried to put a price on that, every product that we purchase would be 100 times more expensive than what it is today. And it's because we just outsource all of the negative social and environmental and ecological externalities, onto the world, onto the poor, onto the hidden side of humanity, right? We don't have a debit column in how we interact with modernity. We just assume that everything is positive without really taking into account the negative, right? Illich, however, very early saw that there were trade-offs, right? That there was a debit column that we had to take into account. And he took that very seriously. He said, what are the drawbacks? What are the negative aspects that come with industrial modernity, right? And he focused on the hidden expenses, the debits, the externalities of that system. And he said that today what we have is a modernized form of poverty, right? He said poverty used to be this idea of scarcity, of dearth, of not having the necessities of life. But he said modernized poverty, what he saw as modernized poverty was defined by a growing dependence on mass-produced goods and services that gradually eroded the conditions necessary for a convivial life. Right? So this upward escalator of growth, of technological advancement that required people to leave behind their tradition, leave behind the vernacular realm, leave behind, the subsistence economy that they grew up in, for dozens and hundreds of generations, that eroded the ability, the skills, the knowledge, the physical conditions, right, that allowed this type of vernacular life to to thrive. And he said, this is a quote from another book that he wrote at about the same time that he was writing Tools for Conviviality, a title that's fantastic, The Right to Useful Unemployment. He said that modernized poverty appears when the intensity of market dependence reaches a certain threshold. Subjectively, it is the experience of frustrating affluence. I love that term, frustrating affluence, that occurs in persons who are mutilated by their reliance on the riches of industrial productivity. It deprives those affected by it of their freedom and power to act autonomously, to live creatively. It confines them to survival through being plugged in to market relations. In other classes, we've talked about how this specialization of the global economy, the globalization of the world in which we live. Essentially, the vast majority of people today know how to do one thing, right? How to sell their labor on the marketplace for a salary, and then they outsource all of the other necessities of their life, right? And so that's kind of what most people assume. That's what development organizations assume is good and positive. We assume that what people need to do is to learn one thing, plug themselves into the market economy, learn a skill, learn a trade, whatever it might be, and improve their monetary income. For Illich, this was the prime, the foundational example of what modernized poverty is. It's about this massive dependence on this economic system that keeps us enslaved, that limits the freedom of human action, right? And he said, when we cross this threshold, that's when modernized poverty really begins to take off. Another kind of example of this modernized poverty is that Illich says that the process of commodity proliferation destroys cultures, right? So we see this especially in the world of food, right? So I was recently talking with a friend who's from some Polynesian island, right? And he said one of the things that's interesting about Polynesia, all of these islands in the South Pacific, is that it has the highest rate of obesity in the world. So about 75% of people who live on these group of islands in the South Pacific are obese, but got to a very serious aspect. People are dying of diabetes, of heart conditions and things like that. And he said it's because in the last 50 years, traditional diets, whereas people used to, fish and they would grow taro root and they would, survive on coconuts, all of these things that were developed and how people learned to feed themselves with healthy foods that came from the soil, that came from the ocean, that was drastically replaced by commodities, right? So the importation of fatty foods, of fast food. He said, most people no longer cook for themselves on these islands. People saw it as this liberation from having to go out and fish, from having to grow their own foods, from having to harvest the coconuts. It was seen as this great, advantage that now we could just, go to the store and buy these pre-made meals and things like that. But the result of that has not only been serious health problems through obesity, but the loss of skill, of knowledge of how to feed the human body in a healthy way, right? And this creates unprecedented levels of dependence. People no longer know how to grow their own food, no longer know how to fish on these islands, right? And they're dependent on the market mechanisms for food commodities, which are not healthy, right? This makes for conflicts. The have-nots must fight for their share of the goods because having these goods is the basic condition of life, right? So today we say that poverty in the United States, for example, is about people who do not have enough money to buy food at the grocery store, right? But Illich said if we just go back a generation or two, poverty was about not having the ability or the conditions to grow your own food. And there's a fundamental difference in that, right? If we think of poverty as just monetary poverty, not being able to buy things that we need for our life, well, then we're taking apart a whole new issue, right? What about the ability to have land, to have knowledge, to have access to tradition that allowed people to grow healthy, thriving nutritional diets, right? The alternative, according to Illich, is to refuse this commodity relation, refuse the idea that poverty is only about not having the money to go to the grocery store, right? And understand that reskilling people in this case, in order to be able to grow their own food, and by reducing dependence on commodities and on market relationships is one of the best ways to escape modernized poverty, right? I'm going to go a little bit faster so we can finish up. So he called this alternative conviviality, right? So in order to avoid the counterproductivity that results from the modernization of poverty, Illich advocated for the human ability to recognize and return to natural scales and natural limits. We must come to admit that only within limits can machines take the place of slaves, he said. Beyond these limits, they lead to a new kind of serfdom. Right? They're only up to a limit we can of industrial productivity. But when we become completely dependent upon them, then we're starting to say that things are changing, right? This is a new type of slavery, right? The convivial society, then, according to Illich, is a modern society of responsibly limited tools. And tools are not just the technologies we use, but also the systems, the professions, the institutionality of the world in which we live. There is a place for institutions. There is a place for certain systems, but up to a point. And we need to be able to maintain a level of autonomous human action, right? Where we do not become completely dependent upon those systems, right? Conviviality then stands in direct opposition to the industrial, consumer-driven, increasingly digital productivity of today's economic status quo. He says that this convivial vernacular economy that he dreams of, is about autonomous and creative intercourse amongst persons, and the intercourse of persons with their environment. And this in contrast with the conditioned response of persons to the demands made upon them by others and by a man-made environment. He believed that people should have this ability to connect and maintain a sense of tradition, autonomy over their physical environment, right? Instead of being conditioned to exist in a world, right? The people who think that spending 4 to 6 hours of their lives in the man-made environment of traffic jams, he would be very critical of that. He said we need to move beyond this sense of dependency and reconquer a sense of kind of human autonomy of the mind that understands that this is not normal, right? To the degree that a person masters his or her tools, he or she can invest the world with his or her meaning. To the degree that we are mastered by our tools, the shape of the tool determines our own self-image. So convivial tools were about maintaining a level of autonomy over the tools, the technology, the institutions that govern our lives, right? I'm going to skip this part, but there's a great kind of example of this idea of maintaining control over the tools and institutions and the technologies of our lives is a theme that goes back thousands and thousands of years. In the Far East, in China, the Tao Te Ching was written 3,000 years ago. And towards the end, I'm going to read a quick verse. This was written 3,000 years ago by Lao Tzu. And it speaks exactly, I think, to this crisis moment in which we find ourselves today. If a country is governed wisely, Lao Tzu says, its inhabitants will be content. They enjoy the labor of their hands and don't waste time inventing labor-saving machines. Since they dearly love their homes, they aren't interested in travel. There may be a few wagons and boats, but they don't go anywhere. There may be an arsenal of weapons, but nobody ever uses them. People enjoy their food, take pleasure in being with their families, spend weekends working in their gardens, delight in the doings of the neighborhood. And even though the next country is so close that people can hear its roosters crowing and its dogs barking, they are content to die of old age without ever having to go to see it. I love that image, and I have a friend who works with migrants in El Salvador and young people who are thinking about migrating to the United States. And he says, look, if we can create a sense of autonomy, of creating our own realities, right? Then we could, he translated the last 4 lines. He said, even though the American dream is being transmitted through our radios, through our TVs, through our smartphones continuously, even though we continuously hear the images and see the images of what life might be like at the end of the escalator, we might choose to continue to live in our own reality of our own making. And I love that. Let me see. I'm going to see if I might. We kind of talked about this already, so we'll skip this one. Um, so yeah, the problem is that the demands made by tools on people are becoming increasingly costly, increasingly manipulative, right? We have succumbed to the false expectation that somehow human action can be engineered to fit into the requirements of the world as conceived as technological totality. And again, I think this is the problem with the world of development, that we try to force communities in the third world, especially rural agrarian communities, that in order to overcome their poverty, they have to accept a modernized form of poverty, using Illich's term, right? And he fears that humanity will become enveloped in this physical, social, and psychological milieu, right? This new environment of our own making, a prisoner in the shell of our technology, right? Um, and so to kind of end, to leave a little time for questions, what does all this have to do with development, right? And here's the question. Is development about tooling man for the milieu, tooling man to fit into this new ecological environment, or of our hyper-industrialized and increasingly digitalized world? If that's what technology is about, right? We're going to talk next week, given all of these budget cuts and how USAID and European Union and all of these big donors are saying outright that if you want our money, you have to create a development project that shows that what you're doing is benefiting our economic and strategic foreign interests, right? So if we're going to continue to development, is it about tooling these projects for the milieu of this new type of hyper-colonization, right? Or should development and educational projects really be focused on helping people to adapt to the marketplace, to become their own brand, to fit into the modern world with our own personal meaning and artistic touch. I'm going to argue right now and then in the next week a little bit more in depth that good development projects should focus on helping people and communities to reduce the dependencies of modernized poverty, right? To reduce the dependencies, on the industrial system in which we live, right? To discover the necessary thresholds to the tools and institutions governing our lives, not just saying no to every technology, no to every institution, no, but understanding that there is a level that is a correct scale, right? And construct a world of proper balance, equilibrium, and elegance. And one of my kind of famous one of the things I most like from Greek mythology and Greek history is the figure of Diogenes, who's not very well known. There's not a lot written about him, but he was a very, very kind of contrarian figure, one that was always questioning. And there's this great kind of dialogue that was recorded between him and another Greek philosopher named Aristippus. And so a philosopher named Aristippus, who had quite willingly sucked up to Dionysus. Dionysus was the god of fertility. And so this philosopher said that my well-being is in sucking up to Dionysus, right? He won himself a spot at his court. He saw the Aristippus saw Diogenes cooking lentils for a meal, right? Cooking this very simple symbol of poverty. And he said to him, if you would only learn to compliment Dionysus, you wouldn't have to live on lentils. If you would only learn if we learned the new strategy of writing projects for USAID that show that these projects are going to be great for the interests of the US economy, right? Then we won't have to worry about changing things. But Diogenes replied to Aristippus, but if you would only learn to live on lentils, you wouldn't have to flatter Dionysus. We wouldn't have to flatter the gods, wouldn't have to flatter the governments. And I think it's about this, about learning to live on lentils, learning to live in the autonomous space of our own creation, right? I'll leave it there. So maybe we can have 10 or 15 minutes for questions. But thank you all very much.